All right, so let us continue on with our conversation about Solow. We have a really important augmentation to the Solow, and then that will lead us into our conversation on endogenous growth. So if we just sort of think about kind of what the Solow model predicts, and then kind of what all this means in terms of what we think matters for economic growth, we get sort of a few things that are especially important. The first thing is that the Solow model predicts that economies are always moving towards steady state. If you go back earlier in the semester, we talked about employment or really unemployment as having this steady state process, that basically we're always moving towards some steady state level of unemployment, and depending upon where we are, we will either be increasing the number of people unemployed or decreasing. Very similar sort of concept here. The economy is moving towards a steady state level of capital per worker, and then dependent upon where it is in that process, that determines whether a country is capital accumulating or capital shedding. For the most part, it seems like countries have been capital accumulating. There are rare instances in which capital shedding has been seen. Depreciation goes up, steady state capital declines. Over time, there are reasons for us to think that there might be changes to depreciation for any number of reasons. One of the more interesting and recent concerns regarding depreciation has to do with climate change. In fact, one of the main ways in which macroeconomists have attempted to model climate change is through that depreciation parameter. You can model climate change any number of ways depending upon your assumptions of the economic consequences of climate change. But we're actually going to sort of end the semester kind of on that particular topic. There's some really interesting DSGE model research that has been done incorporating climate change, and a big place where that often is incorporated ends up being in this sort of depreciation, no pun intended there, depreciation idea, and sort of the context would be that if climate change increases the rate of depreciation due to more extreme weather events, heat, humidity, all the things that we associate with climate change, then it would naturally reduce steady state capital, which then, of course, would sort of contract economic systems, all else equal. Population growth also has to be a thing that we have to really keep an eye on and manage, and make sure we're boosting productivity growth to sort of coincide with population increases. So that's another big piece here, is this sort of autonomous productivity. The idea there is going to be ultimately that countries try to grow over time, primarily through government-funded research, government-funded education, so on and so forth. So the interesting I think about all this is that if you think about where we were in the course, and then kind of we went into this very abstract sort of the economic fluctuations piece ends up being really kind of, interestingly enough, more abstract than the growth. Because in the growth conversation, you're talking about the economy's ability to provide for its citizens, as opposed to just trying to tame inflation, which is equally as important, but a different kind of question, a different sort of notion of question. And then kind of the big thing with Solow model in terms of the policy perspective is just that we want the country to be saving, in a sense, the right amount. Now, what's again sort of a slight diversion here, what's interesting about this savings rate conversation is that if you go back and you just sort of think about things in terms of a Mundell-Fleming model, and we sort of draw the connection here between savings there, one of the arguments as to why the U.S. has such a large trade deficit, imports greater than exports, is because we, if you want to think about it this way, don't save enough. If you want to sort of normatively say a trade balance should be the goal of an economy, which no economists really believe, but if you wanted to say that, then the idea here would be that the lack of savings in the U.S. economy puts upward pressure on U.S. interest rates, And then because there's upward pressure on U.S. interest rates, this causes there to be a larger share of imports relative to exports, or at least it feeds into that particular story. So it's curious here that we talk about sort of savings in the sense of this golden rule, the idea of maximizing consumption. And really, that may seem different. In the other model, we're talking about savings in the context of investment. Here, we're talking about, in a sense, savings with respect to consumption. But the golden rule idea is certainly framed in terms of consumption maximization, because that makes more sense to us from the perspective of that kind of quality of life argument. But the thing about the maximization of consumption is that you would also naturally be maximizing investment relative to that golden rule level. So the assumption here is going to be whatever the golden rule level is, that's maximizing consumption. But we're going to also assume that the economy is going to produce that amount of investment, in a sense, the correct amount of investment. A Solow model doesn't really have any sort of trade flow thing. So we sort of treat capital as capital in the Solow model. But you can imagine that if there are these two different types of capital, foreign capital versus domestic capital, that the sort of model says that there's going to be capital accumulation and capital shedding, regardless of sort of where it's coming from. And that ultimately your economic growth is about capital. It doesn't matter where it sort of comes from, right? So in the Solow model, there's almost no benefit really to domestic capital versus foreign capital. Now, that isn't to argue that there isn't economic benefit, but there just isn't here. But if we think about this idea of the savings rate being too low, another consequence of that is going to be that we have a lot more imports relative to exports. So if policy successfully moves the savings rate up such that we go to the golden rule, and that is particularly a savings rate increasing, the result of that will also end up being quite naturally a reduction in the trade imbalance, because you're going to have the U.S. interest rate now decline against the global interest rate. And so you wouldn't have as much sort of warped trade flows in that sense, if your argument is that trade flows are warped by a too high interest rate in some sense, caused by a lack of savings amongst U.S. consumers. It's an interesting story. I think it's nice to kind of see how this all fits together. Okay, so we've got to do something kind of important here to the Solow model, and it gets complicated, and it sometimes doesn't sort of completely make sense. So what we're going to add to the model is this concept of efficiency. In particular, we're now going to think about units of labor, not just as units of labor, but we're going to think about it as units of effective labor. Basically, the idea is that as E goes up, each worker now needs less capital to produce the same output they previously were producing, right? So the efficiency gain here is that the unit of labor, the individual, does not need as much capital as it did before in order to produce the same output. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that in undergirding sort of all these like economic models are these sort of efficiency forces, right? We set all this up in the context of markets. Our expectation is that there's going to be a natural and near constant search for efficiency in the system. So the argument here is that if E goes up, if the efficiency of each labor unit increases, that from a steady state capital perspective, the economy now needs less capital than it did before. So in fact, the increase in labor efficiency, perhaps counterintuitively, gets put into the same place that we have seen population growth and depreciation ultimately. So again, we're just going to change the way we think about labor. Labor isn't just labor now. Labor is now labor times E, so it's per effective worker. So now we're going to think about the effect of labor efficiency ultimately on the idea of steady state, right? So everything else stays exactly the same as before. The difference now is that Y is no longer just Y divided by L. It's now Y divided by L times E. So output per effective worker and capital per effective worker. So what this ends up creating is, again, kind of the interesting outcome, which is that we just put in that measure G into the same place we put population growth, which is alongside depreciation. So what this does is it alters that break-even investment, right? So as G goes up, break-even investment goes up. As N goes up, break-even, the amount of investment you need to break even goes up. Again, this goes back a little bit to this idea that economics is not just about having productivity growth or having population growth, but in a sense, having an economic system that sort of accommodates those natural facts. So if your economy is going to become more productive, you need to sort of understand what that would do, all else equal. Just in the same way that if your economy is going to become bigger from a population perspective, you need to sort of know how to kind of handle that. And so the productivity thing is interesting because if your labor efficiency increases, then what this is going to mean is that for the same level of output, firms are now going to buy less capital, right? Because they don't need as much capital as they did before because their employees have become much more efficient than they had previously. Now, why this is to an extent problematic is that if, again, all else equals. So in other words, if your productivity stays exactly the same, then for an increase in labor productivity, we actually expect there to be a decrease in steady state capital. And then again, for a concave production function, as we have always assumed, that would actually mean less output than before. And so the idea here is that we're going to sort of couple the sort of growth of output, again, in the context of sort of the ways in which labor operates within capital. Basically, the dynamic of how labor operates with capital or uses capital ultimately ends up defining the steady state growth rate. Now, when we say steady state growth rate, we mean growth rate of the economy in steady state. So if we think about this in the context of capital per worker, output per worker, so on and so forth, then output per worker grows at G, that is that increase in productivity, and then total output is therefore going to grow in the steady state at N plus G. Now, when we go back to the sort of golden rule idea, now it's going to be the case that net marginal product of capital, net of depreciation in steady state is going to, its golden rule is going to equal population growth plus efficiency growth. That should make sense. Again, we want to think about this in the context of used capital. And so if N is staying the same and G goes up, then the amount of used capital, right, is going to decline because we don't need as much capital as we did before, right? Now, how does that sort of work in the context of marginal product of capital, right? Well, we'll think about a concave, production function, like as before, right? If we have a concave production function, y is a function of capital per worker, and output here, right? What's marginal product capital? Marginal product capital is, oops, that's not tangent. Marginal product capital is just the slope of the production function, as we have mentioned, right? Just slopes, right? MPK. So the argument here, right, is that as we decrease wherever we are in terms of output, our marginal product of capital is higher there. So when we say that for a given growth in G, all else equal, marginal product of capital is going to go up, the reason why marginal product of capital is going to go up is that for a given level of G, steady state level of capital declines. Well, steady state level of capital declines, marginal product of capital increases, right? Because we have diminishing returns to capital. You have the classic diminishing returns story in economics that becomes a fairly important part of this particular story. Because again, it can be a little confusing for students because you tend to think about, increases in output being good, increases in marginal product of capital being good. But in this case, you have to remember that for a given production function, for a given level of technological progress, right? Again, if we write this as y equals a f of k, again, that sort of technological progress parameter, we can think about sort of, okay, for a given level of capital, right? So let's say This is production function um, here, and then this is a production function there. And so this is production decreasing, right? So we went from y to y prime here. So for some reason, the production function declined. Maybe like a big natural disaster reduces the productivity of a particular country. So you can see that the idea here is that for a given level of capital, we, of course, have this idea that we get less output. Right now, if at the same time your production function is declining again due to a natural disaster, and you are experiencing population growth or you're experiencing growth in productivity, then you're going to see a reduction in your steady state capital. And so therefore you get a lower marginal product of capital. Now, what's important about this is that the lower you go down in your production, the less marginal product capital is for a given level of capital. So if your economy is in a sense in dysfunction, getting worse, your steady state is declining, then what ends up happening, of course, is that population growth and in a sense, efficiency growth works against you. So again, this is where policymakers have to understand that technological growth is good, but it has to be accommodated with a production function that is really sort of ready to absorb that in the same way that we've talked about this in the context of population growth. So the idea here is that we want to have what we refer to as balanced growth. And the big thing here is, again, we want to think in terms of that consumption function. We want to think in terms ultimately here of real wages. We haven't really talked about wages yet in this particular model. However, because we are now ultimately thinking in terms of marginal product of capital, and now we can think also in terms of marginal product of labor, we can have these conversations about real wage. The thing that we know ultimately about the real wage, and in particular marginal product of labor, is that it is increasing in capital. So for an increase in capital, we expect marginal product of labor to increase. Therefore, if an economy is increasing its capital, it's experiencing capital accumulation, one of the predictions here is that we expect real wage to grow. But of course, that's going to grow relative to population, right? So we say here that the real wage grows at the same rate as output divided by labor. So while the real rental price is constant in the context of the real world, meaning that because you experience these increases in productivity over time, then for a given level of capital, you would see marginal product of capital increasing, right? But because the increase in all of these growths, right? So an economy is growing from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3. That's also pushing out its steady state capital, right? Its steady state capital is now moving in this particular direction. So what we're doing is, all right, we're moving from this slope to this slope to this slope to this slope. And the idea here is that in balanced growth, all these slopes would end up converging to being the same, such that the real rental rate, marginal product of capital, ends up being constant. So the question is, do we see that? Do we see that with balanced growth, the real rental rate generally be constant while real wages rise, right? That would be the evidence that this is in some sense quite true, is that if we see marginal product of capital stay constant, but we see real wage rise as a result. And so the second sort of part of that is that if that is true, if marginal product of capital is constant through balanced economic growth while real wages rise, what this means is that as economies are moving across their steady state as they grow, real wages are rising. And then the sort of nature of all this means that all countries should eventually converge to the same real wage. This is the perhaps maybe the part of the model where you lose people, and certainly it's a part of the model where we start to really call the theory into question, and we certainly go and we check it with the actual data. And so in the data, what we find is that there is not this convergence to the extent that the model would predict. So we see some convergence at some time, but we see typically a fairly significant lack of convergence. And so people have used that as sort of ammunition and called the whole sort of idea of Solow into question here. I think the fact that the Solow explains constant rental rates with higher real wages is still great for the particular model. That it then also sort of argues in terms of convergence. No, that it doesn't mean that the Solow model doesn't work. What it simply means is that we reframe the Solow model as explaining growth dynamics on a country by country basis, where we calibrate either literally in our model or just mentally in our sort of thought experiment, the model to those particular countries. In the same way, by the way, that we did when we thought about, again, small open economy, and we wanted to think about the United States being a very large open economy. And so we really just kind of did that in our head, right? We thought about the sort of two extremes, and then we knew the US was sort of somewhere in the middle. And so it's a kind of a very similar story here. No, we don't see the convergence that we would sort of predict if we took the Solow model to its sort of full logical conclusion. But rather what we do see is that the Solow model does a great job, generally speaking, of explaining within country growth dynamics. And so it explains single country situations when we calibrate our thinking to those particular countries, but doesn't necessarily generalize in that sense. That's fine, right? From an economic model perspective, that doesn't really sort of affect us at all. And really what it does is it brings up this really interesting idea is conditional convergence. So basically, what we expect is that economies will converge to a standard of living over time, but that the dynamics of the country are going to affect both the actual sort of, in a sense, standard of living relative to marginal benefit. Because the thing that's sort of interesting about this conversation of standard of living consumption is that different countries have sort of different social norms, different cultural considerations. Some are more consumption than, like in the US, we're a materialist, consumption heavy economy. That isn't true necessarily in other parts of the world. And so therefore the nature of what this all means for actual human happiness is, I think, quite interesting. And so as a result, the nature of how an economy converges over time to a standard of living it seems to be hold up quite well, and it just is sort of on the condition of condition. What's going on in that country, and sort of how quickly or how slowly are they going to be moving towards this sort of particular perspective. All right. The other big thing that this brings into consideration, and really this kind of stylizes a very modern sort of view of all these conversations, has to do with sort of factor productivity, the extent to which capital is invested in, is generated, and then ultimately is utilized by humans. That becomes a hugely important part ultimately of the Solow growth model. And really ends up being a big sort of part of the way macroeconomists, especially those who are focused on growth, really think about economics. And then therefore what represents differences in developing economies in terms of income, standard of living, and all this particular sense. The one sort of key thing that we see over and over and over, the sort of one thing that we know very sort of well, is that the higher, basically the more technology you have, and or the more sort of human capital you have on the education side, you're just going to have a much more productive economy. So, there's not really a lot of magic to that. If you want a productive economic system, you need efficient capital, and you need humans that know how to work with that efficient capital. Again, this is where we sort of think both in terms of how do we get economic growth, and then how do we manage it to again, maximize the extent to which that generates prosperity for individuals. And then we get sort of into, why are these things occurring? And there's all sorts of sort of ways to think about this. Everything from the fact that economic growth sort of creates these positive externalities that kind of begets economic growth. I think, again, going back to this sort of animal spirits argument, that Keynes made about sort of investment. I think when people feel good about the economy, when they wake up and the streets are clean and the buildings look nice and the schools are high quality, that people just feel better about the economy, and then therefore they will invest and sort of be optimistic about those particular growth prospects. That isn't at all to argue that all you got to do is get the streets clean and fix the potholes, but rather that in a world driven by expectation, and we've already covered that in the short term in the previous models, that the way in which people feel about the economy, the way in which people feel about their ability to benefit from the economy is ultimately going to end up mattering into how much investment you get, how much consumption you get, how much people are saving, how much people are sticking under their mattresses, so to speak. That stuff ends up really mattering. And so, again, the big thing here in the Solow model comes down to saving. Again, too little versus too much, so on and so forth. This is, I think, the place where there's a lot of debate as to kind of what this looks like from a population perspective, and what that means for that population savings rate. And again, in a world of faster technological progress, there is generally downward pressure on savings. There's more things to buy. There's more money to spend. For example, technology takes up a much larger part of our take-home pay than it used to. And so we have to think about, how does technology play into our need to continue saving? Because if our economy becomes completely consumption and there's no investment, then our capital is just going to shed and shed and shed and shed, and then eventually that's going to turn into economic contraction. All right, and so that's a big sort of piece of this. I think ultimately this is also why economists don't really worry so much about the lack of population growth. I mean, I think that it's somewhat concerning, but I think because we tend to think in terms of efficiency, a decline in population growth isn't necessarily the worst thing. It is sort of problematic if, like, over the very long run, you actually are going to see large-scale declines in population. If the growth rate of population is kind of declining, that's one thing. If your actual population is declining, that sort of becomes a completely different thing. So this brings into all sorts of interesting conversations about, well, maybe, in those areas of the world where there's very rapid population growth, richer countries can sort of facilitate their low population growth rates with relatively open border policies that allow immigration. That would have a two-pronged effect. It would bring in people to, in a sense, fill the gap on your now lower population numbers, and it would also take pressure off of those less developed economies where the population growth rate can really actually be quite problematic. That's obviously fraught with all sorts of political and social issues, and I'm not at all suggesting that people should necessarily do that, but it would be one way out of a problem of developing economies having really high population growth and then rich countries having very low population growth. All right, and so we can sort of ask ourselves: is the U.S. at or below or getting towards the golden rule? Therefore, what should the U.S. be doing in terms of its particular savings rate? So, if you work through all of this, we end up kind of at the case that the U.S. is below their golden rule steady state. So therefore, we should seek to increase the savings rate, which would increase consumption per capita. And so, yeah, that's what we're kind of stuck with, right? Because increasing consumption in the very short term causes there to be decrease in consumption over the long run. So a lack of savings today causes there to be less consumption over the very long run. And I think that, this needs to be part of the conversation we ultimately have. We very often kind of frame this in a very kind of overly basic way. We should be saving more and consuming less. But the sort of the pitch to people is we save more, we consume less, but over our lifetimes, we're going to consume more. And so we're going to be happier at the end of our life than we would have been had we not just consumed everything. That plays into a lot of kind of different ways of looking at life and kind of old versus young and all this various stuff. But the economics there are fairly clear. How do we increase the savings rate in an economic system? There's a number of ways to do it. Increasing interest paid on retirement accounts would be a way to do it. You could shift to a more consumption-based tax, vis-a-vis like a value-added tax like they have in Europe, right? Europe has higher savings rates. And one of the arguments of that is that because in Europe they predominantly rely upon consumption taxes, this takes the sort of marginal benefit of consumption and reduces it, and then thereby virtue of that increases the marginal benefit of saving. In the U.S., we have a situation where it's sort of the opposite. The marginal benefit consumption is much higher relative to the marginal benefit of savings for various reasons. And so therefore we get less consumption over the long run. Okay. And then just sort of two more key points here. There is a worry here for economists. And the worry is that when you start talking about managing economy, managing growth, keeping it productive, so on and so forth, what politicians often do is they take those arguments and then they say, okay, then therefore, these are the industries that we should have. We should have these particular industries. To an economist, that shouldn't be a choice. That's going to naturally be generated by all the various comparative advantages across the entire global economic system. What you produce is not really so much the concern as ensuring that you are producing it well and that your economy is producing labor that can assist in producing it well. That is sort of the particular concern. So as a result, this ends up putting a heavy emphasis on those types of sort of capital investment that seem to be less direct into the production function, but certainly seem to accentuate the production function. Everything from public infrastructure, human capital. I think we very often lose sight of the fact that the U.S. economy has been so successful, not just because of good policy or a highly productive economic system, but also because we have facilitated that economic growth in so many ways that we likely take for granted, right? Roads, interstate highway system, right? Think about, the sort of ability to fly from New York to San Francisco in 3-4 hours. And what does that do to business? How much lubrication does that add, to a capitalist system? I think it's quite profound. But what you have to be careful with is the picking of particular industries, right? That's industrial policy is fraught with picking things that will ultimately be losers and not picking things that would have been winners. And then there's this hindsight bias and this now we start talking about lobbying effects and confirmation bias and all sorts of corruption, because industrial policy ends up being heavily valuable to the industries that would benefit from it. So they have a reason to invest in lining politicians' pockets. And, you think about this in developing economies, especially. I mean, one of the key things that we think holds back a lot of developing economies is corruption. And a lot of that corruption originates with industrial policy by the government or, in some sense, policy by foreign investors as well. All right. So I think we'll stop there, and then we will move our conversation into endogenous growth tomorrow. And so kind of put a button now on the Solow model, giving you a lot to think about. And so enjoy those conversations.